Okay, so I just found out about this essay that Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI wrote and released in reference to the state of the Church, not only in sexually, what's going on with the whole sexual abuse scandals and the homosexuality involved in seminary and the seminaries and the attacks of bishops and the hiding of all of this information, moving priests around, all of that. It's not only about that. From what I've been able to read, it is a general explanation of what happened to the church and why we are in the state we are in right now. I haven't read all of it. The purpose of this is I'm just going to read it. And if I stop along the way to have some kind of commentary, then I stop along the way to have some kind of commentary. So hopefully I saw this, the reason I'm doing this is I saw this and I got this incredible urge just to do this, just to read this, because I loved Benedict XVI and I was so heartbroken when he decided to step down. And I can't imagine for Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, to step down and allow this other Pope to step in. The amount of pressure that he was under was, well, I felt very, very sad for him. All that being said, I'm just going to start reading this, and if I see something that I want to comment on, then I will do that. Other than that, I'm just going to read it straight through. So here we go. On February 24th to 24th, at the invitation of Pope Francis, the President of the World Bishops' Conferences gathered at the Vatican to discuss the current crisis of the faith and of the Church, which are pretty much the same. A crisis experienced throughout the world after shocking revelations of clerical abuse perpetrated against minors. One note here, this is not only against minors, this is also against priests and adults as well in a homosexual manner. So this is not only against minors, so don't be confused by that. The extent and gravity of the reported incidents has deeply distressed priests as well as the laity, and has caused more than a few, that's right, and more each and every day, to call into question the very faith of the Church. Here's the thing, I just want to stop right here. I don't question the faith of the Church. The Church is always the Church, no matter what. And I don't question, I question the hierarchy. I question the bishops. But I don't ever question the Church and its teachings. That comes from Christ and isn't messed with. So I don't question the faith of the Church. Actually, the faith of the Church, yeah, I guess so, but not the Church itself. Because the faith of the Church comes from men, and men are always susceptible to the prince of lies. So it was necessary, I continue, so sorry. It was necessary to send out a strong message and seek out a new beginning, so to make the Church again truly credible as a light among peoples and as a force in service against the powers of destruction. One thing I want to add here. The Church, as the Church goes, as the QAnon say, where we go one, where we go all. As the Church goes, so as civilization goes. If the Church does not guide, if the Church does not lead, if the Church does not open the path to heaven and keep it open and keep it clear and concise and precise in what we have to do, because that's the Church's only job, is to get us from this dirt ball to heaven. That is it. And that is in service to Christ and in service to God, the triune Godhead. So all of this that's happening, all of this comes from the fact that the Church has advocated its power to lead to a bunch of men that have decided that their ideas, including their sexual perversions in homosexuality and beyond that, are more important than serving Christ on the cross. So, let's continue. Since I myself had served in a position of responsibility as shepherd of the church at the time of the public outbreak of the crisis, and during the run-up to it, I had to ask myself, even though, as emeritus, I am no longer directly responsible, what I could contribute to a new beginning. So what he's saying is that even though I'm not the boss, I am still, as a servant of God, I am still held responsible for trying to bring the church to a new beginning. Thus, after the meeting of the President of the Bishops' Conferences was announced, I compiled some notes by which I might contribute one or two remarks to assist in this very difficult hour. Having contacted the Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, and the Holy Father, Pope Francis himself, it seemed appropriate to publish the text in the Klersblatt, it's this German, Klerusblatt, I don't know, a monthly periodical for clergy in mostly Bavarian dioceses. So his work, he says, my work is divided into three parts. Excuse me. In the first part, I aim to present briefly the wider social context of the question, without which the problem cannot be understood. So there's a base. He wants to give us a base for understanding where this all came from. I tried to show that in the 1960s, an egregious event occurred on a scale unprecedented in history. Don't be confused. It's not Vatican II. Vatican II was good. It was implementation in this country especially, in the United States especially, and how everybody thought that it was a good idea to go off on their own little mission and their own little, how they interpreted it. The church made a mistake. The hierarchy of the church made a mistake by not making it clear. This is how this is to be interpreted. This is how to be handled. This is how it's supposed to be done. You're not allowed to make any decisions on your own, because the minute you give somebody the ability to do that, they're going to ultimately do what they want to do and not what is best for the church, and that's what's happened here. So I tried to show that in the 1960s an egregious event occurred on a scale unprecedented in history. It could be said that in the 20 years from 1960 to 1980, the previously normative standards regarding sexuality collapsed entirely. That's correct. And a new normalcy arose, or abnormalcy, that has by now been the subject of a laborious attempts at disruption. That's a mouthful. In the second part, I aim to point out the effects of this situation on the formation of priests and on the lives of priests, which are the blood of Christ in the world, the priest. No priest, no Eucharist. Don't forget that. No priests, no Eucharist, and that's what Satan wants. Finally, in the third part, I would like to develop some perspectives for a proper response on the part of the church. So, number one, subsection 1. The matter begins with the state-prescribed and supported introduction of children and youth into the nature of sexuality. In Germany, and then Minister of Health, Ms. Kate Strobel, had a film made in which everything that had previously not been allowed to be shown publicly, including sexual intercourse, was now shown for the purpose of education. What at first was only intended for the sexual education of young people, consequently was widely accepted as a feasible option. Similar effects were achieved by the Sexkoffer, published by the Austrian government, a controversial suitcase of sex education materials used in Austrian schools in the late 1980s. Sexual and pornographic movies then became a common occurrence, to the point that they were screened at newsreel theaters. He has some German word here, Bonhofskinos. I'm not sure what that is. My German is non-existent. I still remember seeing, as I was walking through the city of Regensburg one day, crowds of people lining up in front of a large cinema, something we had previously only seen in times of war, when some special allocation was to be hoped for. So like giving out food or something like that, I guess. I also remember arriving in the city on Good Friday in the year of 1970 and seeing all the billboards plastered up with a large poster of two completely naked people in a close embrace. So you can see where this is all, the church is not stepping up, and therefore civilization is deteriorating. Among the freedoms that the Revolution of 1968 sought to fight for was this all-out sexual freedom, one which no longer conceded any norms. And we are reaping the rewards of that now. That's me. That's right. The mental collapse was also linked to a propensity for violence. This is why sex films were no longer allowed on airplanes, because violence would break out among the small community of passengers. And since the clothing of that time equally provoked miniskirts and things like that, aggression, school principals also made attempts at introducing school uniforms with the view of facilitating a climate of learning and not staring at some girl's rear end. That was me. Part of the physiognomy of the Revolution of 1968 was that pedophilia was then also diagnosed as allowed and appropriate. Good grief. For the young people in the church, but not only for them, this was in many ways a very difficult time. They have always wondered how young people in this particular situation could approach the priesthood and accept it, with all of its ramifications. The extensive collapse of the next generation of priests in those years and the very high number of laicizations were a consequence of all of these developments. So what he's saying here is that because of all this baloney, with all this sexual stuff and everybody pushing towards that, listen, wanting to engage in sexual intercourse and all that goes with that is a strong and driving force, and God made it that way because he wanted to perpetuate the species. He wanted more people here to love him and serve him and worship him. He wanted us all to be happy with each other. But then what happens, and it always happens, is Satan takes that and perverts that into something that he wants. And because we have free choice, God gave us that gift of free choice. Ultimately, man who was by his very nature fallen has a tendency to do the wrong thing unless he is guided by the church and the teachings of the church and ultimately Jesus Christ on the cross. So as we continue, number 2, at the same time, independently of this development, Catholic moral theology suffered a collapse that rendered the church defenseless against these changes in society. That's right. I will try to outline briefly the trajectory of this development. Under the Second Vatican Council, Catholic moral theology was largely founded on natural law, while sacred scripture was only cited for background or substantiation. In the Council's struggle for a new understanding of revelation, the natural law option was largely abandoned, and a moral theology based entirely on the Bible was demanded. I still remember how the Jesuit faculty in Frankfurt trained a highly gifted young father, Bruno Schruler, with the purpose of developing a morality based entirely on Scripture. Father Schruler's beautiful dissertation shows the first step towards building a morality based on Scripture. Father Schruler was then sent to America for further studies and came back with the realization that from the Bible alone, Scriptura sola Scriptura, that from the Bible alone, morality could not be expressed systematically. He then attempted a more pragmatic moral theology, which being able to provide an answer to the crisis of morality. In the end, it was chiefly the hypothesis that morality was to be exclusively determined by the purposes of human action that prevailed. While the old phrase, the end justifies the means, was not confirmed in this crude form, its way of thinking had become definitive. Consequently, there could no longer be anything that constituted an absolute good. So now here appears the beginning of relativism. And any more than anything was fundamentally evil. So there was no black and white good. No more black and white good and evil. There just wasn't. Everybody could say, whatever, the phrase, whatever makes you feel good, do it, that kind of baloney. There could be only relative value judgments. There no longer was the absolute good, but only the relative better, contingent on the moment and on circumstances. Relativism. The New Age baloney. The crisis of the justification and presentation of Catholic morality reached dramatic proportions in the late 80s and 90s. On January 5, 1989, the Cologne Declaration, signed by 15 Catholic professors of theology, well, you know you're in trouble now, was published. It focused on various crisis points in the relationship between the Episcopal Magisterium and the task of theology. Reactions to this which at first did not extend beyond the usual level of protest, very rapidly grew into an outcry against the magisterium of the Church and mustered, audibly and visibly, the global protest potential against the expected doctrinal text of John Paul II. He has some references here. The lexicon, it's all German though, and I'm not, whose editors include Karl Rahner and Cardinal Walter Casper. So Pope St. John Paul II, who knew very well the situation of moral theology and followed it closely, commissioned work on an encyclical that would set these things right again. It was published under the title Veritas Splendor on August 6, 1993, and we know how that went. And it triggered vehement backlashes on the part of moral theologians. Before it, the Catechism of the Catholic Church already had persuasively presented in a systematic fashion morality as proclaimed by the Church. I shall never forget how then leading German moral theologian Franz Beckel, who, having returned to his native Switzerland after his retirement, this is important, so listen to this, announced in view of the possible decisions of the encyclical Veritas Splendor, that if the encyclical should determine that there were actions that were always and under all circumstances to be classified as intrinsically evil, he would challenge it with all the resources at his disposal. It was God the merciful. Benedict chooses his words very good. It was God the merciful that spared him from having to put his resolution into practice. Beckel died on July 8, 1991, and the encyclical was published on August 6, 1993, and did not include the determination that there were actions that can never become good. The Pope was fully aware of the importance of this decision at that moment, and for this part of his text, he had once again consulted leading specialists who did not take part in the editing of the encyclical. He knew that he must leave no doubt about the fact that the moral calculus involved in balancing goods must respect a final limit. There are goods that are never subject to trade-offs. You can't barter evil. Sorry. There are values which must never be abandoned for a greater value, and even surpass the preservation of physical life. Now, this is where Western man is different than maybe the European. This is where the United States, right here, this part that he's going to cover here, and I believe Western man also has a problem, not only sexually, but this problem here. So let's read this again. There are values which must never be abandoned for a greater value, and even surpass the preservation of physical life. There is martyrdom. In this country, and this is me talking, in this country, United States, martyrdom is an anathema. Nobody wants to talk about dying. We're all going to live forever, and we're all going to be beautiful, blah, 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 blah. But the fact of the matter is, everybody dies, and there are civilizations that accepted that. Whereas I've always accepted that, because death is always around them. We tried to hide it from our children, we hide it from ourselves, we hide it from everybody, that death is ultimately going to come to everyone. Now, we may have these violent movies, but they do not depict the heart of the fact that man is mortal, and death is only a gateway to heaven. Death is only a gateway to the Creator. Death has to be stepped through. That door has to be stepped through in order to go to our real life, our true life, what we're supposed to do. This life now. The church militant is only a small, insignificant nothing compared to what Jesus, what the Almighty Father, and what the Holy Spirit have planned for us for all eternity. So anyway, so there is martyrdom. God is about more than mere physical survival. A life that would be bought by the denial of God, a life that is based on that final lie, is a non-life. Now, that's Benedict. Martyrdom is a basic category of Christian existence. There's a Latin saying. Let me see if I can find it. Hold on. I say it when I read about the martyrs in the morning. I have this little section I read about the martyrs. This was from Father John Hardin. It says, so far from crushing Christianity or destroying the church, here we go. So every single pope up to the 4th century died a martyr's death. That's right. So far from crushing Christianity or destroying the church founded by Christ, martyrdom actually contributed to the growth of a Christian civilization. The phrase, and this is the phrase I was trying to get to, sanguis martyrum et semen Christianorum, which means the blood of martyrs is the seed of Christians, was not some pious aphorism. It was a literal fact of history. And that's from Father John Hardin, a Jesuit, brilliant man, very holy man. Anyway, so let's continue. The fact that martyrdom is no longer morally necessary, in theory, advocated by Beckel and many others, showed that the very essence of Christianity is at stake here. So martyrdom is a critical part of the advancement of Christianity, whether you like it or not, because our lives are not what's important. Our service to God is what's important. There's the distinction. We think life is important. We think our lives are important. Life is important because it's God's creation. The life of the unborn, the life of the elderly, all that's all important. But it's not the ultimate. The ultimate thing is service to God and His commandments and what He wants us to do. That's it. So in moral theology, continue here. In moral theology, however, another question had meanwhile become pressing. The hypothesis that the magisterium of the Church should have final competence, infallibility, only in matters concerning the faith itself, gained widespread acceptance. So what they did was they have kind of jammed that into a little cage in a little box, rather than saying that we can have infallibility in other areas as well. So in this view, questions concerning morality, should not fall within the scope of infallible decisions of the magisterium of the Church. That's a mistake. There is probably something right about this hypothesis that warrants further discussion, but there is a minimum set of morals, which is indissolubly linked to the foundational principle of faith, and which must be defended if faith is not to be reduced to some theory, but rather to be recognized in its claim to a concrete life. All this makes apparent just how fundamentally the authority of the Church in matters of morality is called into question. Those who deny the Church a final teaching competence in this area force her to remain silent, precisely where the boundary between truth and lies is at stake. Independently of this question, in many circles of moral theology, the hypothesis was expounded that the Church does not and cannot have her own morality. Good grief. The argument being that all moral hypotheses would also know parallels in other religions. There is only one religion. And therefore a Christian property of morality could not exist. That's that, I love you, you love me, the Barney theology. But the question of the unique nature of biblical morality is not answered by the fact that for every single sentence somewhere, a parallel can be also found in other religions. Rather, it is about the whole of biblical morality, which as such is new and different from its individual parts. The moral doctrine of Holy Scripture has its uniqueness ultimately predicted in its cleaving to the image of God, in faith in the one God who showed Himself in His Son, Jesus Christ, and who lived as a human being among us. The Decalogue is an application of the biblical faith in God to human life. The image of God and morality belong together, and this result in the particular change of the Christian attitude towards the world and human life. Moreover, Christianity has been described from the beginning with the word hodos, Greek for a road, in the New Testament often used in the sense of a path of progress, so moving forward towards heaven. Faith is a journey and a way of life. In the Old Church, the catechumenate was created as a habitat. This is important here. This part here is, and I've wondered why we don't do this more. Faith is a journey and a way of life. In the Old Church, the catechumenate was created as a habitat against an increasingly demoralized culture in which the distinctive and fresh aspects of the Christian way of life were practiced and at the same time protected from the common way of life. In other words, when you want to become a Catholic, you are separated from all the baloney that's going on out there so that you can focus on the faith. I think that even today, something like catechumenal communities are necessary so that Christian life can assert itself in its own way, so God can speak to them without all the noise. Cardinal Sorrell wrote a book recently, something about silence. I haven't read it all. The beauty of silence, and it's important that we stop and listen to what God, because God speaks to us all the time, every day, all the time. But because of who we are and what we do, we just don't have time for Him. What a sad revelation. So now we're in part 2, initial ecclesial reactions. Part 2, number 1. The long-prepared and ongoing process of dissolution of the Christian concept of morality was, as I have tried to show, marked by an unprecedented radicalism in the 1960s. This dissolution of the moral teaching authority of the Church necessarily had to have an effect on the diverse areas of the Church. In the context of the meeting of the President of the Episcopal Conferences from all over the world with Pope Francis, the question of priestly life, as well as that of seminaries, is of particular interest. As regards the problem of preparation for priestly ministry in seminaries, there is in fact a far-reaching breakdown of the previous form of this preparation. In other words, there used to be, seminaries were one way, and they have now devolved, not evolved, but devolved into something that is very difficult for a seminarian to work his way through and finally become a priest. In various seminaries, homosexual cliques were established, which acted more or less openly and significantly changed the climate in the seminaries. In one seminary in southern Germany, candidates for the priesthood and candidates for the lay ministry of the pastoral specialists, they lived together. At the common meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, seminarians and pastoral specialists ate together. The married among the laymen, sometimes accompanied by their wives and children, and on occasion by their girlfriends. You can't have someone who was, well, Benedict says it better. The climate in this seminary could not provide support for preparation to the priestly vocation. The Holy See knew of such problems without being informed precisely. As a first step, an apostolic visitation was arranged of seminaries in the United States. As the criteria for the selection and appointment of bishops had also been changed after the Second Vatican Council, the relationship of bishops to their seminaries was very different too. Above all, a criteria for the appointment of new bishops was now their conciliarity, which of course could be understood to mean rather different things. See, that whole understood to mean rather different things, he's right about that. Indeed, in many parts of the Church, conciliar attitudes were understood to mean having a critical or negative attitude towards the hitherto existing tradition, which was now to be replaced by a new, radically open relationship with the world. One bishop who had previously been seminary rector had arranged for the seminarians to be shown pornographic films. Good grief. Allegedly with the intention of thus making them resistant to behavior contrary to the faith. That's like, who did this? Who was the Indian guy? What was his name? Gandhi used to sleep with his nieces, his female nieces, naked, with the same intent, allegedly with the intention of thus making him resistant to behavior to the contrary. Yeah, whatever, buddy. There were, not only in the United States of America, individual bishops who rejected the Catholic tradition as a whole and sought to bring about a new, modern Catholicity. You need to, as an aside, you need to find a priest who went through the seminary 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I know several priests, and their stories are horrendous, how they were treated, how they couldn't even kneel during Mass, how they couldn't kneel to receive communion, how they couldn't stand to do certain parts, how they had to stand. It was incredible that they took out the kneelers and he would still kneel. So, that being said, the smoke of Satan had definitely gotten into the church with these guys. So individual bishops who rejected the Catholic tradition as a whole and sought to bring about a new, modern Catholicity in their dioceses. Perhaps it is worth mentioning that in not a few seminaries, students caught reading my books. He's talking about his own books by Ratzinger, at the time Cardinal Ratzinger, were considered unsuitable for the priesthood. My books were hidden away like bad literature and only read under the desk. Sounds like Germany in the 30s and 40s. Good Lord. The visitation that now took place brought no new insights. You would think people would learn. Oh, never mind. The visitation that now took place brought no new insights, apparently because various powers had joined forces to conceal the true situation. And they've been doing it ever since. These bishops learned how to hide, that's why it's important that all these investigations that they're doing now ultimately evolve into a RICO investigation, and that way they can go in and they can get what they need. The federal government can go in and just take it, because that's what's needed. They need to be ousted. All these bishops and all these priests and all these clerics and everybody needs to be brought out. All this documentation needs to be brought out, just like in Pennsylvania. That all needs to be brought out. Kathleen's Diocese, fuminated my books, and the visitation now took place, so they were hiding things, right? A second visitation was ordered and brought considerably more insights, but on the whole failed to achieve any outcomes. So they all said, yeah, there's a problem, and then they just said, well, okay, whatever. Nonetheless, since the 1970s, the situation in seminaries has generally improved. Not yet, and yet, only isolated cases of renewed strengthening of priestly vocations came about as the overall situation had taken a different turn. Number 2. The question of pedophilia, as I recall, did not become acute until the second half of the 1980s. In the meantime, it had already become a public issue in the United States, such that the bishops in Rome sought help, since canon law, as it is written in the new 1983 code, did not seem sufficient for taking the necessary measures. Its practical sense, I don't even understand that. Rome and the Roman canonists at first had difficulty with these concerns. In their opinion, the temporary suspension from priestly office had to be sufficient to bring about purification and clarification. This could not be accepted by the American bishops because the priest thus remained in the service of the bishop and thereby could be taken to be still directly associated with him. Oh, he was worried about his own rear end and not the children. Only slowly, a renewal and deepening of the deliberately loosely constructed criminal law of the new code began to take shape. In addition, however, there was a fundamental problem in the perception of criminal law. Only so-called guarantorism, a kind of procedural protectionism, they give it all these fancy names so you don't know what it actually is, was still regarded as conciliar. This means that above all the rights of the accused, had to be guaranteed. Get that? Let me say that again. This means that above all, the rights of the accused had to be guaranteed to an extent that factually excluded any conviction at all. What the? No wonder we're in trouble. As a counterweight against the often inadequate defense options available to accused theologians, their right to defense by way of guarantorism was extended to such an extent that convictions were hardly possible. So they were allowed to engage in their pedophilic perversions, basically immune within the church. This is why to this day, however, that the church, even recently, within the last 3 months, the church has come out, several bishops have come out and said, listen, if you see this thing going on, don't go to the police, come to us. Yeah, right, that's over. That party is over. That ship has sailed. Nobody's going to the bishops anymore. They're going right to the police. Let me see. This means that above all the rights of the accused, but the base financial guarantees and convictions were hardly possible. Okay. Allow me a brief excursus at this moment. In light of the scale of pedophilic misconduct, a word of Jesus has again come to attention which says, oh boy, this is right. Benedict is such I miss him so much. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better of him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he was thrown into the sea. The Gospel of Mark 9, chapter 9, verse 42. The phrase, the little ones, in the language of Jesus means the common believers who can be confounded in their faith by the intellectual arrogance of those who think they are clever. Father, or Bishop Barron. So here Jesus protects the deposit of the faith with an emphatic threat of punishment to those who do it harm. never mind. The modern use of the sentence is not in itself wrong, but it must not obscure the original meaning. In that meaning it becomes clear, contrary to any guaranteeism, that it is not only the right of the accused that is important and requires a guarantee. Great goods, such as the faith, are equally important. A balanced canon law that corresponds to the whole of Jesus' message must therefore not only provide a guarantee for the accused, the respect of whom is a legal good, it must also protect the faith, which is also an important legal asset. A properly formed canon law must therefore contain a double guarantee: legal protection of the accused, legal protection of the good at stake. If today one puts forward this inherently clear conception, that generally falls on deaf ears when it comes to the question of the protection of the faith as a legal good. Of course, because the faith contradicts what they want. In the general awareness of the law, the faith no longer appears to have the rank of a good requiring protection. This is an alarming situation, which must be considered and taken seriously by the pastors of the Church. I would now like to add to the brief notes on the situation of priestly formation at the time of the public outbreak of the crisis a few remarks regarding the development of canon law in this matter. So, in principle, the congregation of the clergy is responsible for dealing with crimes committed by priests. But since guarantoorism dominated the situation to a large extent at the time, I agreed with Pope St. John Paul II that it was appropriate to assign the competence of these offenses to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, under the title Delicta Maiora Contra Fidem. I wish I knew what that meant. Fidem is fidelity. I'm not sure. This arrangement also made it possible to impose a maximum penalty, which is, i.e., expulsion from the clergy, which could not have been imposed under other legal provisions. This was not a trick to be able to impose a maximum penalty, but is a consequence of the importance of the faith of the Church. In fact, it is important to see that such misconduct by clerics ultimately damages the faith. Bloody morons see that. I mean, these guys, he's right. Only where faith no longer determines the actions of man are such offenses possible. Let me say that again, because Michael Voris says this a lot when it comes to supernatural faith and what these bishops and immoral clerics have. Only where faith no longer determines the actions of man are such offenses possible. The severity of the punishment, however, only presupposes a clear proof of the offense. The aspect of guarantoorism remains in force. In other words, in order to impose a maximum penalty lawfully, a genuine criminal process is required. But both the dioceses and the Holy See were overwhelmed by such a requirement. In other words, they want their dirty laundry, aired. We therefore formulated a minimum level of criminal proceedings and left open the possibility that the Holy See itself, which was a mistake, would take over the trial where the diocese or the metropolitan administration is unable to do so. You can't, see, this is bad, you can't police yourselves. You can't do that. Either the laity need to get involved or secular police forces and judicial systems. In each case, the trial would have to be reviewed by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith in order to guarantee the rights of the accused. The problem with all this that's coming up here is that the fact that some of these guys who were part of this were actually also participating in the pedophilia, participating in the homosexuality, doing all the things, and they were worried about all this stuff coming out and exposing them as well. Finally, in the Feria of the Fourth, the Assembly of the Members of the Congregation, we established an appeal instance in order to provide for the possibility of an appeal. Okay. So some parishioner comes up and says, "You're messing with my little boy in the sanctuary," and the priest says, "No, that's not true." And he was, even though he may have been convicted or laicized or whatever, and he had the possibility of appeal. But being laicized, nobody does that. Because of this actually went beyond the capacities of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, and because delays arose which had to be prevented owing to the nature of the matter, Pope Francis has undertaken further reforms. Yeah, let's put a bigger band-aid on this mess. Part 3. So what must be done? Perhaps we should create another church for things to work out. Oh, is that Pius the 13th or whatever it is? Pius the 9th, that whole group, the schism group? Hold on, let me see who that is. I don't want to be banging on some poor pope. What we got here? The Society of SOCIE of Pope Pius X. That's the schism group. Fraternitas Sancti. It's also known as SSPX, yeah. Society of Pope Pius X. Of St. Pius X, rather. So anyway, so what's to be done? Perhaps we should create another church for things to work out. Well, that experiment has already been undertaken. I haven't read this part yet, so, and has already failed. Only obedience and love for our Lord Jesus Christ can point the way. Don't forget, we are the only church. We're it. The Catholic Church is it. Everything else is everything else. We are the way to hell's salvation. We are the way to heaven. Our church, the Catholic Church, the church started by Jesus Christ. He didn't start all these other churches. He started his church, and he made Peter the first pope. We're it. So that means that we are responsible for civilization. We are responsible for getting man to heaven. And when we shirk our responsibilities, we spit in the face of Christ on the cross. It's that simple. So, well, that experiment has already been undertaken, has already failed. Only obedience and love for our Lord Jesus Christ can point the way. So let's first try to understand anew and from within ourselves what the Lord wants and has wanted with us. First, I would suggest the following. If we really wanted to summarize very briefly the content of the faith as laid down in the Bible, we might do so by saying that the Lord has initiated a narrative of love with us and wants to subsume all creation into it. As an aside, if you go to the Bible and place the word love with the first sacrifice, all that would work out just fine. And that's what I really believe it's all about, sacrifice. The counterforce against evil, which threatens us, and martyrdom is part of that. I keep going off on a tangent. The counterforce against evil, which threatens us and the whole world, can ultimately only consist in our entering into this love. It is the real counterforce against evil. The power of evil arises from our refusal to sacrifice for God, to love God. He who entrusts himself to the love of God is redeemed. Our being not redeemed is a consequence of our inability to love God through our own selfishness. Learning to love God is therefore the path of human redemption. So, let us now try to unpack the essential contents of God's revelation a little more. We might then say that the first fundamental gift that faith offers us is the certainty that God exists. A world without God can only be a world without meaning. For where, then, does everything that is come from? No matter what these guys say, everybody, it doesn't matter. God is it. In any case, it has no spiritual purpose. It is somehow simply there and has neither any goal nor any sense. Then there are no standards for good or evil. Relativism again. Now, continuing, then only what is stronger than the other can assert itself. Power is then the only principle. Truth does not count. It's who wins. It actually does not exist. Only if things have a spiritual reason are intended and conceived. Only if there is a creator, God, who is good and wants the good, can the life of man also have meaning. That there is God as creator, and as the measure of all things is first and foremost a primordial need. But a God who would not express himself at all, who would not make himself known, would remain a presumption, and could thus not determine the form, gestalt, of our life. For God to be really God, in this deliberate creation, we must look to him to express himself in some way, identify himself. He has done so in many, many ways, but decisively in the call that went to Abraham, and gave people in search of God the orientation that leads beyond all expectation. God himself becomes creature, speaks as man with us human beings. In this way, the sentence, God is, ultimately turns into a truly joyous message, precisely because he is more than understanding, because he creates and is love. To once more make people aware of this is the first and fundamental task entrusted to us by the Lord. That's right, each and every one of us. A society without God, a society that does not know him and treats him as non-existent, is a society that loses its measure. In our day, the catchphrase of God's death was coined. That's right, that Nietzsche and all those clowns. When God does die in a society, it becomes free, we were assured. In reality, the death of God in society also means the end of freedom, because what dies is the purpose that provides orientation. Oh, what a good sentence. Let's say that again. In reality, the death of God in a society also means the end of freedom, because what dies is the purpose that provides orientation. And because the compass disappears, that points us in the right direction by teaching us to distinguish good from evil. Western society is a society in which God is absent, boy, that's the truth, in the public sphere, and has nothing left to offer it. And that is why it and that is why it is a society in which the measure of humanity is increasingly lost, murdering millions of babies every year, slaughtering the innocent, murdering the elderly. At individual points, it becomes suddenly apparent that what is evil and destroys man has become a matter of course. That is the case with pedophilia. It was theorized only a short time ago as quite legitimate, but it has spread further and further, and now we realize with shock that things are happening to our children and young people that threaten to destroy them. The fact that this could also spread in the church and among priests ought to disturb us in particular. Isn't that the truth? Why did pedophilia reach such proportions? Ultimately, the reason is the absence of God. We Christians and priests also prefer not to talk about God because this speech does not seem to be practical. After the upheaval of the Second World War, we in Germany had still expressly placed our Constitution under the responsibility to God as a guiding principle. Half a century later, it was no longer possible to include responsibility to God as a guiding principle in the European Constitution. God is regarded as the party concern of a small group and can no longer stand as the guiding principle of the community as a whole. As an aside, I saw some statistics where the Catholic Church is only 23% of the total population of the United States. And I will tell you this, even those 23 out of those, maybe 10% of those are Orthodox, that actually go to Mass every week, go to confession, and enjoy all the sacraments. The churches in this country, and in the West in general, is dying a slow, painful, and agonizing death. The decision reflects the situation in the West where God has become the private affair of a minority. Isn't that the truth? A paramount task which must result from the moral upheavals of our time is that we ourselves once again begin to live by God and unto Him. Above all, we ourselves must learn again to recognize God as the foundation of our life instead of leaving Him aside as somehow an ineffective phrase. I will never forget the warning that the great theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar once wrote to me on one of his letter cards. Do not presuppose the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but present them. Great men. Indeed, in theology, God is often taken for granted as a matter of course, but concretely one does not deal with Him. The theme of God seems so unreal, so far removed from the things that concern us, and that everything becomes different if one does not presuppose, but present God. Not somehow leaving Him in the background, but recognizing Him as the center of our thoughts, words, and actions. God became man for us. Man as His creature is so close to His heart that He has united Himself with Him. Oh my goodness. And has thus entered human history in a very practical way. He speaks with us. He lives with us. He suffers with us, and He took death upon Himself for us. If they could just get that part. Sorry. We talk about this in detail in theology, with learned words and thoughts, but it's precisely in this way that we run the risk of being masters of faith instead of being renewed and mastered by the faith. Yeah, renewed and mastered by that's good words. Forgive me. Let us consider this with regard to a central issue, the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. This ought to be good. Our handling of the Eucharist can only arouse concern. The Second Vatican Council was rightly focused on returning the sacrament of the presence of the body and blood of Christ, of the presence of His person, of His passion, death, and resurrection, to the center of Christian life and the very existence of the Church. I'm going to read that again. The Second Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council was rightly focused on returning this sacrament of the presence of the body and blood of Christ, of the presence of His person, of His passion, death, and resurrection, to the center of Christian life and the very existence of the Church. In part, this really has come about, and we should be most grateful to the Lord for it. And yet a rather different attitude is prevalent. What predominates is not a new reverence for the presence of Christ's death and resurrection, but a way of dealing with Him that destroys the greatness of this mystery. The declining participation in the Sunday Eucharistic celebration shows how little we Christians of today still know about approaching the greatness of the gift that consists in His real presence. If they only knew about the miracle. The Eucharist is devalued into a mere ceremonial gesture when it is taken for granted that courtesy requires Him to be offered at family celebrations or on occasions such as weddings and funerals to all those invited for family reasons, all those who are not Catholic. Pagans. The way people often simply receive the Holy Sacrament and communion as a matter of course shows that many see communion as a purely ceremonial gesture. Therefore, when thinking about what action is required first and foremost, it is rather obvious that we do not need another church of our own design. Rather, what is required first and foremost is the renewal of the faith in the reality of Jesus Christ given to us in the Blessed Sacrament. Great words. In conversations with victims of pedophilia, I have been made acutely aware of the first and foremost requirement. A young woman who was a former altar server told me that the chaplain, her superior as an altar server, also introduced the sexual abuse he was committing against her with the words, oh man, let me say this again, so I'll finish it this time. A young woman who was a former altar server told me that the chaplain, her superior as an altar server, also introduced the sexual abuse he was committing against her with the words, "This is my body which will be given up for you." Good grief. It is obvious that this woman can no longer hear those very words of consecration without experiencing in all the horrific distress of her abuse. That's very true. Yes, we must urgently implore the Lord for forgiveness, and first and foremost, we must swear by Him and ask Him to teach us all anew to understand the greatness of His suffering, His sacrifice, and we must do all we can to protect the gift of the Holy Eucharist from abuse. Number 3, and finally, there is the mystery of the Church, the sentence which Romano Guardini almost 100 years ago expressed the joyful hope that was instilled in him and many others remains unforgotten. Quote, "An event of incalculable importance has begun. The Church is awakening in souls." Unquote. He meant to say that no longer was the Church experienced and perceived as merely an external system entering our lives as a kind of authority, but rather it began to be perceived as being present within people's hearts, as something not merely external but internally moving us. About half a century later, in reconsidering this process and looking at what had been happening, I felt tempted to reverse the sentence. The Church is dying in souls. Indeed, the Church today is widely regarded as just some kind of political apparatus. One speaks of it almost exclusively in political categories, and this applies even to bishops, who formulate their conception of the Church of tomorrow almost exclusively in political terms. Very true. The crisis caused by the many cases of clerical abuse urges us to regard the Church as something almost unacceptable, which we must now take into our own hands and redesign. But a self-made church cannot constitute hope. And we see what happens. There are 16,000 different kinds of Protestant churches, and there's all kinds of religions, and none of them serve God. Jesus himself compared the church to a fishing net, in which good and bad fish are ultimately separated by God himself. There is also the parable of the church as a field in which the good grain that God himself has sown grows, but also the weeds that quote-unquote, an enemy secretly sow into it. Indeed, the weeds in God's field, the church, are excessively visible, and the evil fish in the net also show their strength. Nevertheless, the field is still God's field, and the net is God's fishing net. And at all times there are not only the weeds and the evil fish, but also the crops of God and the good fish. It's got to accept the bad with good. To proclaim both with emphasis is not a false form of apologetics, but a necessary service to the truth. In this context, it is necessary to refer to an important text in the Revelation of St. John. The devil is identified as the accuser who accuses our brothers before God day and night. Revelation 12, chapter 12, verse 10. St. John's Apocalypse thus takes up a thought from the very center of the framing narrative in the book of Job. Job 1 and 2, 10, 42, 7 through 16. In that book, the devil sought to talk down the righteousness of Job before God as being merely external. And exactly this is what the Apocalypse has to say. The devil wants to prove that there are no righteous people, that all righteousness of people is only displayed on the outside. If one could hew closer to a person, then the appearance of his justice would quickly fall away. So when put to the test, you turn on God. The narrative in Job begins with a dispute between God and the devil, in which God had preferred to Job as a truly righteous man. He is now to be used as an example to test who is right. Take away his possessions, and you will see that nothing remains of his piety, the devil argues. God allows him this attempt, from which Job emerges positively. Now the devil pushes on and he says, "Skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But put forth thy hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face." God grants the devil a second turn. He may also touch the skin of Job. Only killing Job is denied to him. So now he's going to make him suffer. For Christians, it is clear that this Job, who stands before God as an example of all mankind, is Jesus Christ. In St. John's Apocalypse, the drama of humanity is presented to us in all of its breadth. The Creator God is confronted with the devil, who speaks ill of all mankind and of all creation. He says not only to God, but above all to people, "Look at what this God has done." Supposedly a good creation, but in reality full of misery and disgust. That disparagement of creation is really a disparagement of God. It wants to prove that God himself is not good, and thus to turn us away from him. The timeliness of what the Apocalypse is telling us here is obvious. Today the accusation against God is, above all, about characterizing his church as entirely bad, and thus dissuading us from it. The idea of a better church created by ourselves is in fact a proposal of the devil, which he wants to lead us away from the living God through a deceitful logic by which we are too easily duped. Now do you know, even today the church is not just made up of bad fish and weeds. The church of God also exists today, and today it is the very instrument to which God saves us all. It is very important to oppose the lies and half-truths of the devil with the whole truth. Yes, there is sin in the church and evil. Let me start that over again. It is very important to oppose the lies and half-truths of the devil with the whole truth. And those truths are, yes, there is sin in the church and evil. But even today, there is the Holy Church, which is indestructible. Today there are many people who humbly believe, suffer, and love, in whom the real God, the loving God, shows himself to us. Today God also has his witnesses, martyrs, in the world. We just have to be vigilant in order to see and hear them. Also, to be a martyr does not necessarily mean you have to die. The blood of the martyrs is effective, and the blood of the martyrs is necessary. But those of us who are afraid to say that we are Catholic to other people, we are martyrs as well. I don't suffer from that. I want everybody to know I'm Catholic, but there are people out there who won't say they are, for fear of what the world will think of them. The word martyr is taken from procedural law. In the trial against the devil, Jesus Christ is the first and actual witness for God, the first martyr, who has since been the king of martyrs, and who has since been followed by countless others. Today's church is more than ever a church of the martyrs, and thus a witness to the living God. If we look around and listen with an attentive heart, we can find witnesses everywhere today, especially among ordinary people, but also in the high ranks of the church who stand up for God with their life and suffering. It is an inertia of the heart that leads us to not wish to recognize them. One of the great and essential tasks of our evangelization is, as far as we can, to establish habitats of faith, and above all, to find and recognize them. I live in a house, in a small community of people who discover such witnesses of the living God again and again, everyday life, who joyfully point this out to me as well. To see and find the living church is a wonderful task which strengthens us and makes us joyful in our faith time and time again. Excuse me. At the end of my reflections, I would like to thank Pope Francis for everything he does to show us again and again the light of God, which has not disappeared even today. Thank you, Holy Father. Benedict XVI. What a wonderful essay. It was well needed, well worded. Got me all excited. So, I'm going to post this on my website. You'll also have the YouTube to listen to the entirety of the essay. Okay, thank you for listening. God bless each and every one of you.